Okay, thank you. So, Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, once told a joke. He only told one joke in his entire career in a work called Thoughts for the Times on War and Death. And in that, he reported about a man who wrote a letter to his wife who said, "Darling, if one of us should die before the other, I think I shall move to Paris." That's a classic example from Freud that the speaker doesn't think it's him who will die. But the reality is we will all die. And we keep forgetting that. Even in palliative care conferences, people think they're helping other people. But actually, we die. And many people grieve. And even more are involved in caregiving. If not now, tomorrow. If not tomorrow, the next day. In every instance, that's the case. And dying is not the last 24 hours. It's not even the last 48 hours. It's not even the last week. It's often that journey from prognosis, the time when the doctor gives you your life expectancy, to death. Or worse, from diagnosis. For some people, a diagnosis is enough to change their identity as somebody who will die soon. And grief doesn't last 6 months, like the American Psychiatric Association would have you believe. Doesn't even last 6 years. Grief is forever. We keep moving it around when it gets uncomfortable and keeps popping up here and there, and there's lots of things that make it come and go, and it changes as the years change. It's like a marriage, really, and a friendship, and work. Grief is one of those things that work on you, and you work on it. It's a life project. And caregiving doesn't just last for a short time either. In other words, death, dying, grief and caregiving is a lifestyle. And the bulk of it doesn't happen in front of a doctor or a nurse. It happens here, in community. And so the real questions in palliative care, the real fundamental questions in palliative care is, what are we doing in community? So we have to remember, we have to shore up what are the fundamental values of hospice and palliative care. What is it really all about when we talk about caring for the dying, caring for caregivers, and caring for those living with grief and bereavement? What's it all about? Well, the first one is that we have to remember the 95% rule. Always remember the 95% rule. Dying people spend less than 5% of their time in front of a doctor or a nurse. 95% of the time, they spend alone, or with friends, or with families, or with the television set, or the internet, or the stereo, or with the dog, the cat, or the neighbourhood. If you're interested in end-of-life care, that is where the action is. Not the 5%, the 95%. And we have to remember what's called the social epidemiology, the pattern of injury and illness and death that's associated with dying, caregiving, and grief and loss. One of the interesting things about the social epidemiology, or the patterns of injury and illness and death associated with dying and living with caregiving and bereavement, is that the social epidemiology is similar for all three groups. Dying is actually surprisingly easy to do. That is to say, becoming dead is actually surprisingly easy to do. Only takes a few minutes of your time. It's the journey before then that's the problem. It's the anxiety. It's the depression. It's the loneliness. It's the social isolation. It's the social rejection. It's the stigma. It's the lost school days. The lost job. And worse, it's the suicides and the sudden death. And sadly, these are not just the only things that apply to dying. They apply to caregivers and people who live with grief and bereavement. And yet, all of these things are amenable to prevention. And if we can't prevent them, harm reduction, we can reduce the damage they do. Either way, it's about early intervention, upstream work. We need to act before, not during, before as well as during. And the third thing we have to remember in palliative care is to balance our understanding of dying and caregiving and grief and bereavement with the idea of health and well-being. If you do a review of the palliative care literature, especially the palliative medicine literature, dying looks like a train wreck. If you review the psychiatric and the psychological literature on bereavement, bereavement looks like a disaster. But it's not true. It's not true. Good things happen while people live with a life-limiting illness. Good things come from grief. Good things come from caregiving. I did a study at the beginning of my career, interviewing 100 people with less than 6 months to live. Yes, about 12% of people reported that their spouses left them after their prognosis, just deserted them. Friends crossed the road to avoid them. But the majority of people were drawn closer to their partners, had greater intimacy, made more friends, strengthened the ones they had. You don't read that in the Lancet. You read about the bad stuff. Half the hospitals, the university scholarships, the buildings, the policy changes, the political activists come from people who have been bereaved. More than half the movers and shakers of social change, good social change in our society, comes from people who've lost others. Grief and bereavement is a driver of compassion and social change. Death, dying, caregiving and loss, we have to have a balanced view of it. And we want to increase the good and minimise the harm. It's a bit like love. Only teenagers and Americans think love is beautiful. The rest of us know that it has dark side. Anybody who's been in marriage for longer than 2 years knows there's some very dark moments in a marriage. Dark moments in friendships. Not every brother and sister get on. It's not all about sex and confetti. Love is complicated. So is dying. So is grieving. So is caregiving. And we must hold that balanced picture in our mind when developing our policies and social actions. So compassionate communities are therefore ways in which public health approach to end of life materialises for everybody. It's where people in every civic sector contribute, do their bit. Hospice and palliative care services provide hospice and palliative care services. But remember, those services are physical or medical, psychological, social and spiritual. So in the matter of social, psychological and spiritual, every social institution in our society can provide palliative care. And should. The workplace, the faith groups, the schools, the arts community, the neighbourhoods, the local government, the football club, the golf club. Each and every one of these social institutions should provide palliative care because each and every one of them provides health care. Do you even think why you've got a seatbelt in your car? What's that got to do with engine performance? Nothing. It's there for your own health and well-being, those seatbelts. This building is guaranteed not to fall down on you whilst I'm speaking because of health safety regulations. Every social institution in our society has a health and safety policy and an action plan. When your children go to school, you expect them to come back with all 2 arms and 2 legs and a head and to be healthy, not just to be educated, but to be protected and to come back the way you sent them. So where is the school's palliative care policy? Where is the school's policy for supporting that child as a caregiver, or as someone who grieves, or as somebody who lives with a life-threatening or a life-limiting illness? Every civic institution in our society should have a palliative care policy. What palliative care are they providing? And only when that happens can we really talk about continuity and quality of palliative care. Continuity and quality of palliative care is not just a matter of switching from doctors to social workers or social workers to occupational therapists. It's about handing the patient back into their community and finding out how the community is continuing that palliative care when that adult or child goes back to school, back to the retirement home, back to shopping, back to the neighbourhood, back to the workplace, and back to worship. That's continuity of care. And it's where, in the end, palliative care becomes everybody's business, in real time and in real practice. If palliative care is everybody's business, what does that look like? So here are the main practice principles of public health palliative care. Community development. Community development is often called compassionate communities. It's where neighbourhoods in particular and small groups within a community decide to participate in the important work of support. Community support, social support, psychological support, spiritual meaning making and spiritual support. Social ecology, where whole cities develop policies across their sectors. In the UK, we have Plymouth and Birmingham as compassionate cities and Sheffield, and we have another 4 or 5 coming online. It's where all the major public sectors are developing palliative care policies to support their workers or their students or their teachers or their parishioners in their experiences of grief and bereavement. and in their experiences of living with a life-threatening or life-limiting illness, or growing very old, or in their experiences of caregiving. Public education, it's also important. If we go to dinner tomorrow night and I order battered fish and chips, people will say, that was a good choice, Alan. Battered fish and chips, they do a really good one here. Tomorrow night we go out again and I order the battered fish and chips, no one says anything. And on the third night we go out together and I order battered fish and chips and still no one says anything, although people shift around rather uncomfortably because that's my third go at it. The fourth night we go out to dinner and I order battered fish and chips, and that's just too much for most people. They're going to say, Alan, if you keep eating that battered fish and chips, you're going to die. Try taking a healthier option. Why don't you order the burger or something? That's called peer review, peer pressure. It's not the doctor who's telling me to eat well, it's you, because you know about nutrition, right? Because most of you are middle class, apart from anything else. You go to the supermarket, you don't buy the cereal with 100% sugar. You're not going to be that silly. You just buy the healthy one, right? With 80% sugar. That's health literacy. It helps you make decisions and choices. But if a person comes up to you and bursts out crying and it happens to be an employee, what do you do? Where's your end-of-life literacy then? And yet it should be as second nature as food choices. But it isn't. That's end-of-life literacy. And health promotion. Yes, there is suffering when people die. Yes, there is suffering when people are bereaved. But there are positive aspects. And it's important to remember what the positive aspects are, to be able to articulate them and identify them and promote them. Because it's only by promoting them that we get a balance in our lives. It's important to remember that in the fun times things can go wrong. And that's an important part of prevention and harm reduction. But when things go wrong, it's important that we remember what can go right. And so that health promotion is an important part of being able to instill in populations a balanced understanding of life's travails, rather than to try to navigate that ourselves alone and accidentally. Civic policy development is absolutely essential. It's absolutely essential that every hospice and palliative care service in the country makes that phone call to the local Chamber of Commerce and asks, what palliative care are you providing in your sector? So they can come back on the phone and say, what the hell are you talking about? And then you can tell them about the 95% rule. And you can ring up the local school and say, what is your palliative care policy? Or if you want to ease them in slowly, warm the frog, as the old saying goes, ask them what their healthcare policy at school is. And when they tell you, then ask them after that, what's their palliative care policy? And I bet you they don't have one. And then you can say, would you like one? Because we can help you. So civic policy development is an important part of our public health approach in hospice and palliative care. And partnerships are essential. We are all experts, make no mistake, when it comes to death, dying, caregiving and loss. Most of us are experts. We have experience, often that no one else has. We are the authorities in our lives. But healthcare professionals, palliative care doctors, palliative care nurses, palliative care social workers, chaplaincy, the usual suspects in hospice and palliative care, they bring a certain expertise, a certain valuable experience that ordinary people outside the healthcare service can use. It's valuable to have the partnership with them, because with our expertise about our own experience and their expertise with the experience of hundreds of thousands of other people, it's a perfect marriage. We can work together developing end-of-life literacy programs, community development programs. We can remind people about the 95% rule. We can remind them about the social epidemiology of dying, grieving, and caregiving. We can supply people with real-time, real-life experience of loss and caregiving. And it means that partnerships are a cornerstone of any public health approach. So compassionate communities, to give you a little idea, compassionate communities, there are thousands of compassionate communities around the world now. I've lost count of how many there are in the UK and in Europe, and in Canada a long time. I've lost track of them. There's so many of them, mainly our neighbourhood programs. There are dozens of compassionate cities. Ottawa, which is the capital city of Canada, is a compassionate city run by the Chamber of Commerce, a mafia of businessmen who are running compassionate cities in Ottawa. Bern, where our next international conference is going to be, that's the capital of Switzerland. That is also a compassionate city. That is led by palliative medicine physicians, palliative medicine consultants, as indeed the one in Cologne in Germany is run by palliative care physicians, much to their credit. The one in Taiwan, in Taipei, is run by the hospital system. A major compassionate community in Frome in Somerset in England is run by the local primary care service, GPs, running a major compassionate community in partnership with their local community. Managed to drop their 24-hour emergency after hours rates by 12% by having a compassionate community. Mankato in Minnesota is the first US compassionate city, doing very well, run by a consortium of NGOs, charities. Seville in Spain, the compassionate city, or compassionate Seville, is run by the church, key members of the Catholic Church and some NGOs. Palliative care is everybody's business. Anybody can do it. As long as it's in partnership with health and social care people. Compassionate communities and compassionate cities can be run by anybody and should be run by everybody, because health and safety is run by everybody. We all have a responsibility for health and safety, and we all have a responsibility for end-of-life care. Professional developments, for those of you who don't know, we have an international association, Public Health Palliative Care International. We have a biennial, once every 2 years, international conference series. The next one is in October in Bern in Switzerland. There is a national charity in the UK called Compassionate Communities UK. We have a peer-reviewed academic journal called Palliative Care and Social Practice, published by SAGE. The European Association for Palliative Care has a public health reference group. Public Health England and Palliative Canada have toolkits, primarily for their public health people, because public health people need a little bit more nursing to come along. They always wonder why they should take an interest in palliative care. Funnily enough, the public health movement in palliative care has actually been led by palliative care people and not public health people. Public health people are very slow. They still think death is the enemy. Cute people. So they're some of the first people who need end-of-life literacy, some end-of-life education. But they're coming along. The Scottish Public Health Network and the Scottish Partnership for Palliative Care, of course, are key leaders in Scotland around the public health approach. And of course, the NHS Ambitions Policy for Palliative Care, which is the current end-of-life or palliative care policy in England and Wales, lists compassionate communities as one of 6 major cornerstones of policy and social change in that country. And now we have an Oxford textbook of public health alongside the Oxford textbook of palliative medicine. Public health has always been on the back foot as a movement. 95% of healthcare budgets around the world are spent on building hospitals and training doctors and nurses. Less than 5% of the world's healthcare budget goes on public health. And that will be the way, that'll be the pattern in palliative care, no doubt. But nevertheless, without public health approaches, our accident and emergency, our casualty departments would be overflowing. More people would be killed on the roads, electrocuted at work, sawn in half in factories. Public health is essential. And it's crucial for our efforts at prevention and harm reduction and early intervention. But there are limits to public health. And we must remember that public health even is not a panacea. George Burns, who's a famous American comedian, when he turned 99, he held a press conference. He was an American, that's what they do in America. So he had a press conference and all the journalists rolled up. And at the press conference, he boasted that for every day of his adult life, he smoked a huge Cuban cigar and he drank a large glass of red wine. And one of the journalists said, "But George, what does your doctor say about that?" And he said, "He doesn't say anything. He's dead." If you want to know more, please have a look at the Oxford textbook. It gives you the history of the movement. It gives you an idea of what compassionate communities are about, compassionate cities are about, and how these are part of the broader woven fabric of a public health approach to palliative care. Thank you very much. You want Q&A? Okay, so we have a little bit of time for some one or two questions if people would like to ask them. I'm happy to field them. Don't rush me. It's probably not the best one to ask that, but there were a couple of famous ones that I was associated with some years ago in Limerick that were fantastic compassionate communities. And I understand that in Londonderry or Derry, it's a difficult one to know how to say it, but in that place, I know they've been doing compassionate communities and trying to develop compassionate communities in that region. Maybe the Irish Hospice Foundation can give you a little more information about that, and if they can't, they should.
Thanks, Alan. I didn't even get up there to say thanks very much for the presentation. So thank you. That was fantastic and a lot of information to digest. I guess for me, the 95% rule was really quite remarkable. And then when we were organising this conference around compassionate communities, a lot of people had, slightly different ideas. And you talk about compassionate communities and community development, which actually I think probably equates better for a lot of people. Yeah. So when you're saying about a palliative care policy and comparing it to the likes of a health and safety policy, yep. Is there kind of a framework that ensures that, the compassionate community that you're trying to establish will have sort of like a guiding principle in order to ensure that we're kind of all on this similar path? Not to be the exact same, but...
So we have, if you go onto the international website of Public Health Palliative Care International, or you go onto the national charity website, Compassionate Communities UK, you can download what's called the Compassionate City Charter. And the Compassionate City Charter is literally a small map of what every city or large community looks like. And it allows you to go through that and regulate your networking into local government and workplaces and so forth, asking systematically for cooperation in policy development. So the Compassionate City is the key. Compassionate City Charter is key to making sure that you check every door in each sector of the community in which you live and enlist the cooperation of those sectors. So it's a systematic way to do community development and social ecology, both. Because it's not that bottom-up processes are essential, particularly for sustainability, but for leadership, we need social ecology, so we need top-down things. So if we have top-down and bottom-up, we've got the perfect thing going. Just one or the other is not sustainable. One or the other means a fad. If we have both, it becomes a sustainable piece of social change and policy development. Yes.
Any community? Is it funded from the businesses? I don't exactly know how you set it up. You know what I mean? So I'm asking, I suppose, for an example. If you're saying like Ottawa is amazing, how do we see that? What does it look like?
So Ottawa had simply slapped the Compassionate City Charter down during a major meeting of businessmen in that city and said, can we do this? And the bulk of them said they could do it and they wanted to do it. So they created themselves an NGO, a charity, if you like, and they went about following the Compassionate City Charter. I have to say that every community is different. And so every compassionate community is different. And every history of a compassionate community is different. That's why I mentioned the hospital system in Taipei leading the compassionate communities in and around that city, and Ottawa being led by businessmen. Compassionate community in Sandwell outside Birmingham is led by a housing association. The same thing is operating in Frome, led by the GP service or the primary care service. So every community does it different. The leadership is different. Some use the charter, some don't use the charter. But if you don't use the charter, it's higgledy-piggledy. So some compassionate communities are very strong on partnerships with schools, but not so good at workplaces. Some are very good at developing workplace policies, not so good at being in schools, or have a very poor relationship with the arts and cultural community, for example. How it's done is how you decide you're going to implement the charter, how you decide to approach the schools, how you decide to approach the workplaces, how you decide to approach the local museum and the football club. They start with phone calls. And, you know, a lot of people who in palliative care are clinicians and they're clinically trained, and that can be very intimidating for them. But at the end of the day, most of them have managed to break through that, do it either with their social workers or with their volunteers. Instead of using volunteers to walk dogs and read books to the dying, sometimes they take a group of volunteers who are happy to walk straight into a high school and say, can we help you develop policies to support people who are grieving or who are caregiving at home, or whose parents might be living with life-limiting illnesses, or can we develop a suicide policy, that kind of thing. So there's a tremendous variation, but it starts with a desire to get the civic sector on side and cooperating with a broader vision and action around end-of-life care. And therefore, I wouldn't single out one as my favourite, because they're all so different and they're all doing a great job. And as I've said to many a colleague and many a friend, we're in this game not for perfection, but for direction. We want people to go in that direction. We want societal community cooperation at the end of life, because without it, we have a small corner of clinicians battling away, helping people with things that have a much longer tail back than what they see in their hospices, hospitals, or care homes. Okay. Yes.
here and then I'll go.
I just agree totally with what you're saying. So I work in palliative care, and we're also trying to bring about that social change and demystify the work that we do in our hospices. So I suppose my question to you, you've kind of answered it to the last speaker, is what can we do within the confines of our facilities to move that and become part of that new narrative around dying is not just the business of the institutions, if I call it that, it's the business of community. And we've tried to do a little bit of that with our volunteers in the community, but it's a very slow burner. So if there's any tips that you could give, I suppose, thus inside the gates of these facilities about how we might make this happen quicker and that engagement piece, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Every palliative care service or hospice is different. So I don't really know who you've got in your hospice. And I always say, we don't really want doctors not to be doctors. We don't want nurses not to be nurses. The acute care model and the clinical model of hospice and palliative care is valuable, and no one's saying that we should change that. But what we're saying is to make that work effective, we actually need public health programs, and that's the case in every medical speciality and every nursing speciality. But if you have social workers, for example, social work is a good example where hospices have consistently hired the wrong ones. We consistently hire caseworkers and counsellors. You don't need social workers to be counsellors and caseworkers. Get a counsellor if you want that. What we want social workers to do is, many of them are trained in community development. Hire those ones. Hire the social worker with community development training and let them loose. Let them loose. Let them get on with what they do. If you have some extra funding, hire a health promotion worker. Lots of people in drug and alcohol, in sexual health, in injury, in veterans' health, they all have health promotion workers. Hire a health promotion worker. Use your volunteers. If you have volunteers, use your volunteers differently. Sit down and talk to the volunteers about the 95% rule. Ask how many would have the courage to walk into a school or a Rotary meeting or a Lions Club meeting or a church or a mosque and say, come on guys, how about a palliative care policy? We'll help you. That's how you start. And you should, every hospice should have a copy of the Compassionate City Charter and put it down on the table and say, this is the work, how do we begin? And you problem solve it that way. There's no time like today, and the phone is at the end of your hand.